Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum from center left to center right. I'm Mona Charan, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I'm joined by two of our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, and Damon Linker of The Week. Sitting in for Linda Chavez this week, we're delighted to have Jonathan V. Last, editor of the Bulwark, and our special guest this week is Catherine Rampell, columnist for the Washington Post. As we speak, the House is debating impeachment 2.0. JVL, I'd like to start with you because the thing that got us here is something you outlined in your newsletter today, and you called it the biggest lie. So can you just amplify on that for a minute?
Yeah, the fundamental problem we have is that we've got something akin to polonium poisoning of our political groundwater, and that is the insistence by the President of the United States and more than half of the Republican congressional delegation that the election was fraudulent, that Donald Trump was the true winner of the election, and that the incoming President of the United States is literally illegitimate, is the product of a bloodless junta. And if one takes those things seriously, then people should be in a state of open revolt and revolution, should they not? Right? I mean, it would mean that American democracy has fallen
Mm-hmm.
and that we are in a state of authoritarianism. And so this is, I just don't see any way for anything to get better until this big lie is repudiated by the Republican Party in such a manner that their constituents believe it. Or I should say, believe the repudiation is what I'm trying to say. And so what I look at, it is not enough for Kevin McCarthy to, as he did a few minutes ago, say Joe Biden will be president because he won the election. Like, this is that. No, I'm sorry. That's not good enough. You spent the last 2 months saying the election was stolen, that Donald Trump was the real winner. The standard for how much, people say, well, how much more, how much do you want them to apologize? How much is enough? The answer is they need to do it until the polling on Republicans who think that Trump was the legitimate winner of the election drops to about 10%. That's when we will know that the Republican Party has done enough.
There's an old story about a man who is telling lies about his rabbi, and he feels guilty, and he finally goes to the rabbi and says, "Look, Rabbi, I realize I've told a lot of falsehoods about you, and I'm sorry. I hope you'll forgive me." And the rabbi says, "I will, but first I want you to do something for me." He says, "Of course, anything you say." So he says, "All right, take your feather pillow, go up to the top of that hill, and shake it out." The guy says, "Well, that's weird, but okay, fine." So he goes, he does that, reports back. "Now will you forgive me?" He says, "I will, after you pick up each of those feathers, because that's what your lies have done. They've spread everywhere." Now, for the Republican Party to reverse the damage is going to be a huge undertaking because, as you say, they have been participating. I mean, it isn't just Trump. It could never have gotten to this point. Our democracy could never have been endangered just by one man being a titanic liar. It required the cooperation of an entire ecosystem, an entire party that repeated his lies and that said, I mean, we are all pro McConnell now, but it was McConnell who said, well, the president's entitled to pursue his legal remedies and so on and so forth, thereby granting legitimacy to the idea that there was some sort of fraud to be investigated.
Speak for yourself, Mona, on being pro McConnell. I'm
Right,
sure
right,
not
right.
pro
No.
McConnell.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, Catherine, first of all, thanks for joining us. Great to have
My
you.
pleasure.
You wrote a column recently saying that that President Trump has just never paid a price for anything, and that's one of the reasons to pursue this impeachment now, right?
Yeah, people keep saying, lawmakers, Republican lawmakers keep saying some version of, well, Trump has learned his lesson. Roy Blunt made this comment last Sunday where he said, "Oh, Trump touched the hot stove, and he's unlikely to do it again." Um, I don't know what unlikely means. What are the chances that he'll again try to foment a civil war? 10%, 20%? What's a tolerable level of probability for that for lawmakers? I'd love to know.
Yeah.
Um, but it wasn't just Blunt. A year ago, we heard basically the same argument from Susan Collins, where she said some version of Trump has learned his lesson, therefore I should acquit him in the impeachment trial. No need to convict him, no need to eject him from office. He's learned his lesson. But the only lesson that Trump has ever learned, both from the Confederates who are, aiding and abetting him in Congress and in the White House and elsewhere, and also in his private life, pre politics, has been if you're a star, they let you do it, right? Like we
Mhm.
heard in the Access Hollywood tape, there are never any consequences for anything. So of course he's going to become emboldened. And I think the issue this time around is not so much, well, we need to impeach him because then he'll learn his lesson and won't do something bad. It's that he's going to be gone in a few days anyway. It's not that we're worried about him doing well. I hope not. It's not that we're worried about him, trying to stage a coup once he's out of office a year from now. It's more that he has become emboldened, and if he is not taken out of office, he will do something bad imminently. Daryl Issa made some comment today during the debate where he said something to the effect of, "Well, Trump is not a clear and present danger with so little time remaining in his term, except it's the opposite, right? I mean, if you've ever taken a game theory course, you know that when there's no tomorrow, that's when you have the biggest incentive to defect. That when you have nothing to lose, that's when you're the most dangerous. So he never learned his lessons before, and he certainly hasn't learned it now, and if anything he has a greater incentive than ever to do something really bad because he knows he's going to be out soon. So all of those reasons suggest he needs to be removed from power immediately and needs to have the nuclear codes taken away from him immediately.
Bill, last week you were skeptical of that argument. Do you feel differently now?
Uh, I I wrote my weekly column posted last night in the print edition this morning, dealing with that very question. And I 2 points. First of all, I I came out in a place like Jonathan, uh, that the most important job the Republican Party has to do, no matter how long it takes, is to persuade as many supporters as they can that that this is in fact a big lie, that the election was fairly and freely conducted, that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. That is the sickness that's polluting the body politic at this point. And frankly, it's less about Trump and more about the tens of millions of people who have responded so positively to him and are willing to believe just about anything he says. Now, this task that Jonathan and I agree on is not going to be quick or easy, because the surveys that I've seen suggest that a majority of people who support Trump see themselves as Trumpists, but not necessarily as Republicans. And if they are forced to choose between Trump, the messenger, and their state and local elected official as messengers, most of them will choose Trump. And, as rhetoricians have known going back to classical antiquity, if the messenger is not seen as trustworthy, the communication is unlikely to be persuasive. So there is a very deep problem here. And analytically, the question that exercises me is, why are so many tens of millions of Americans predisposed to believe this kind of message. Until we get to the bottom of that, I think we're going to have a very tough time as a country. With regard to the specific question of impeachment and removal, uh, I came out in a different place because of my analysis of what the long term good of the country requires. Uh, and the template of my analysis is that the accountability frame for analyzing these events points in one direction, and the future common good for analyzing these events and what we should do now points in a very different direction. It's a complicated argument, and a lot of it rests on my question: what would Abraham Lincoln do in these circumstances? And I concluded that he would not come out in favor of impeachment and removal.
He was a wise leader, and that's always a big gun to pull out, the Lincoln one. Damon, let's discuss accountability a little further, but also, if you wouldn't mind getting into a little bit of analysis of what you think is going through the mind, obviously none of us can know, of Mitch McConnell, who last night said something, yesterday afternoon said something really arresting, that he was, he leaked, but obviously intended to leak, that he was pleased that they were impeaching Trump, and that he felt that this would help purge the Republican Party of Trump and Trumpism. But this morning, he has said that he will not. The Senate is in recess. It's subject only to his recall. Schumer doesn't become the majority leader until January 20th, if then. It depends on whether the Senate convenes. And so what do you think that accomplishes? Saying, well, I welcome this, but then not scheduling it, not bringing the Senate back.
Well, I don't know exactly. I always presume, though, with McConnell that it has to do with some kind of a Machiavellian calculation. And they're like, because of the complication of the impeachment process, where first you have a vote in one house to impeach or not. And then if that's a yes, then it moves to the Senate, and then you have a trial where there's a separate vote with a higher threshold and then of course all the Senate rules that give McConnell, at least for now, a lot of power over whether and when that actual trial leading to a vote will take place. That's a very complicated game theoretic set of scenarios. And I think what we saw from him saying on Tuesday, that he was in effect sick of Trump, ready to permit an actual impeachment trial to take place in the Senate because he thought that it would make it easier for the party to move beyond Trump. That I see as him recognizing the way the winds are blowing, and the fact that, yes, last week was appalling. It really scared the crap probably out of him and his caucus and his whole party. He sees the public opinion on it, where even Trump's approval is now down into the low 30s for the first time ever, as well as other polling showing something like 80% of the country thinking that this was a mistake, that Trump, incited this crowd to do that last week. So I think he's decided, all right, I can be in the camp of letting this go forward. But of course, he did not say he would vote to remove him or convict him, because that's a whole different calculus. And given his background and his Machiavellian instincts, he's not going to commit to that till he sees how the vote is going to go. So, I wouldn't expect him to come out and announce anything like that. But it is distressing that today he's now announced that he's not going to let the trial start until after Biden is in office. That is unfortunate. I do not know the answer to the question of precisely. This is the kind of thing I would definitely look to Bill to answer as a kind of institutionalist who knows more about these rules than I do. I don't know what the point of impeaching a president is when he has already left office, other than adding on the stricture that he may never run for office again. But that could be achieved by a separate vote of its own that I believe would require a lower threshold, a simple majority vote.
Simple majority in both houses. Yeah. Bill, you wanted
So,
to weigh
yeah,
in on that?
I think that is not correct.
Okay.
okay.
You know, I reviewed the constitutional language and a bit of the history last night, and here's the way I construe it. Think of it on the analogy of a trial, where the the House in effect serves as the grand jury, bringing the indictment. The Senate serves both as the jury, uh, determining guilt or absence of guilt, and as the judge handing down the sentence. One possible constitutional sentence, other than removal from office, is it is the permanent ban from her holding offices of public trust or profit under the Constitution. But in the same way that you can't sentence someone unless you convict him.
No, I think that Damon and I were referring to this supposed 14th Amendment option, where
Well,
anyone who, yeah.
that wasn't what I heard.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's what.
yeah. I have conflated those two things. Again, that's why I was deferring to Bill. Yeah, for as far as I'm concerned, you've answered the question. That would
okay.
explain why would maybe need to go through what will look far more. I'm afraid. I mean, I think now, if you assume that McConnell's not going to back down on this and we're not going to get a trial until Biden is president and Chuck Schumer's taken over as majority leader, then we have the situation where they're going to have to decide, will they hold it immediately, which will then gum up not only like the Senate calendar and therefore potentially really slow down a lot of cabinet appointment hearings and so forth. But as far as soaking up all the oxygen in the room in the media for weeks, the idea that the first 2 weeks of the Biden administration is going to be devoted to a trial of Donald Trump is not politically great in my view. And then the other option would be to follow what some people like Jim Clyburn have suggested, which is do it like 3 months from now. But then it will really just look like a stunt that has no connection to what's actually happening then, potentially at least. So it's a bit of a mess, I think.
Yeah. Catherine, can I bring, sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Just one last institutional point. The mess is even messier than the discussion up to now has suggested, because all of these timing options presuppose the constitutionality of holding a Senate trial after the office holder has left office.
Isn't there a precedent for that?
There are precedents for that, but those precedents are lower level and have never been tested in the court of law. And the one that I reviewed found in that case, the person who had been impeached was found not guilty by the Senate, and so the question of the validity of the exercise never came up. So we don't know the answer to that question. And if you saw the piece either today or yesterday by former Judge Michael Luttig, who is a very fine conservative jurist, his reasoning was emphatically that it would not be constitutional to proceed in this manner. So it is an untested question. I think that's the best way of putting it, and it would surely be tested if it came to that. And that would be even messier.
There are a number of untested questions, a couple of others that we may be looking at in the next few weeks. One is whether, as I was mentioning earlier, the 14th Amendment gives a possible way to prevent Trump from returning to office, because the 14th Amendment has a provision that says anyone who is engaged in insurrection against the United States can be barred from holding office by a majority vote of both houses. That was what I was referring to, Bill, when you said that's not correct. I think you thought I was talking about impeachment. I wasn't. I was talking about the 14th Amendment option, which apparently is also not much, there isn't much law about that. And then the other thing is, of course, that Trump is almost certainly going to self-pardon. And that, too, has never been tested in the courts. So we'll see how See how that plays out.
I mean, as I see it, I think there are sort of three objectives that I hold, at least, and
Okay.
others may disagree in terms of pursuing some sort of form of accountability, whether it's through impeachment or otherwise. But one is preventing further incitement to violence by Trump himself,
Hmm.
which would mean getting him out of office even before the 20th. And I understand, based on McConnell's announcement today, that that seems increasingly unlikely, but that would be objective number one. Objective number two would be barring him from further office, whether that could be done through the 14th Amendment, or otherwise. And objective number three would be changing incentives for other politicians in the future who might be tempted by their own authoritarian tendencies. That you need to show that there are repercussions, right, for this kind of bad behavior, and not just for Trump, but for, again, all of the allies who have helped him perpetuate the big lie. And they're not all going to be impeached for obvious reasons. Um, it's not how our system is set up. But I do think that there needs to be some sort of reckoning, some sort of consequences that these guys face, Trump and others, whether it's getting booted from office, and probably by the time the next election rolls around, Americans will have forgotten. But they need to, I really think that they need to pay some sort of consequence for the fact that they have, fomented um, this, I don't know, mass delusion. They've fed
Right.
this mass delusion, because otherwise they'll do it again. And we've seen them do it again. I feel like for well over a decade now, there have been uh, elements in the Republican Party, in official positions, who have sort of made this bargain that, well, we can have the crazies in the party, and we can appease them, and they'll help us, they'll give us votes, and we can control them. And that's clearly not the case. And unless they face some consequences for this alliance, and for feeding the crazies, I just think they're never going to adjust their behavior. And that's really what I'm concerned about. I feel like there were so many occasions over the past few years when the Republican Party looked like it was going to face a reckoning. Now, like in 2016, it looked like finally there was going to be a reckoning, that we need to, like, clean house, not have this alliance with the far right media figures, who, the Alex Jones figures and others. um, Something more along the lines of, like, the purge of the Birchers decades ago. That it looked like there was finally going to be a reckoning, because Republicans were going to lose elections, frankly, and that didn't happen. And unless there is some consequence that these politicians face, I just think they're never going to learn from the mistakes that they've made.
JVL, you've been someone who's been hoping to purge the crazies from the party. Well, not that you're a Republican, but from American life, for quite a long time. I would like to get your views on some of the informal sanctions that have been applied through business leaders and others the past week. We've seen Josh Hawley lose his book contract and have some pushback from his mentor, former Senator Jack Danforth, and his biggest donor, and the editors of the major newspapers in his state have called for him to resign. And you've had major American corporations saying that they will no longer donate to the 147 Republicans who voted to decertify the election results. So you're seeing some movement in civil society and in the business world, among elites, if you will. That's not nothing, right?
Well, I mean, it's not nothing. It's a little late.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you guys read Ben Thompson, who writes a really fantastic newsletter called Stratechery, and he wrote about 4 years ago a piece talking about how aggregation theory, which is the one of the theories on how businesses become dominant in an internet world with zero marginal costs, but how what aggregation theory does with news is that it moves the power from the producers of news to the consumers of news. And so what happens is the type of news that people want to consume becomes the more popular news. This is
Mhm.
what Facebook and social media and all the Google News and all those algorithmically controlled sources wind up pretending. And in a world where that is what's going on, I mean, that it's not a coincidence that this stuff dovetails with the rise of Donald Trump, who tells a bunch of people the things they want to hear and creates space for this populism. And I don't know, I have taken the unpopular view that what we need is more moderation and more banning from the big tech companies. And I wish they would just sort of embrace that. But no, people don't generally like to hear that view. So
No, that is I'm so glad you said that because it's a perfect segue into our second topic, which is that the other thing that happened this week is that Trump was deplatformed from Twitter, from Facebook, from other social media. So I applaud that. I think he broke their rules. There should not be special rules for him, and beyond that, he's dangerous. Also, Parler was deplatformed. Again, it seems to me these are private companies. They are not public utilities. They should engage in this kind of editing and gatekeeping function. Anybody disagree?
Well, I don't disagree in this case. When you're dealing with incitement to an insurrection, especially an insurrection directed at reversing the results of a free and fair election, then absolutely that is what is needed. I do worry quite a bit about the kind of free floating instinct toward cancellation for much, much less dramatic sins, moral transgressions, and the tendency of some of these companies to be persuaded to police things in that area. And the worry, I worry that they will be emboldened by their newfound resolution to ban things, to start doing it far more widely, not just on the right, but in the center and the center left, and basically anyone who dissents from a certain moral line. Now, in the present moment, I don't think that's what we should be spending too much time fretting about, because we're in a moment where the real threat is this kind of lunatic right that lives in a self conjured fantasy world that we were talking about earlier. And to address that, we do need to draw lines and enforce them in the way that they are being right now. But for those of us who try to have pundit brains that expand beyond, the immediate week to a little bit longer perspective, I do think this is going to be a problem that we come back to again and again. There are people, sensible people, who don't share my views on a lot of things, but who are smart and interesting and engaged with these debates, like Rod Dreher on the right, who has written about the danger of U.S. tech companies imposing something like a social credit system like they're developing in China, where basically you either toe a woke moral line or you get blackballed. You can't use airplanes, you can't post anything on any social media platform. You're basically erased from public life if you don't go along. That is something that could happen if we let it happen, and we
Well, wait a second. I
must
mean,
not let it happen.
the companies don't have the kind of power that the state has in China. That's preposterous.
Well,
I mean, in
I
China,
will
the state
say
can
no.
prevent you from getting on an airplane. I mean, Twitter can't revoke your driver's license and keep you off United Air.
Not de jure, but de facto, we live in a society that is, I'm very pleased to say, American life has a very rich, thick civil society, and these companies exercise an unbelievable amount of power within that society. I could totally imagine a time in the future where someone who says the quote unquote wrong thing becomes the object of scorn throughout social media, and then an airline says, in order to show that we're on the side of what's right here, we will not let this person on our planes. That is totally within the realm of the possible. Again, it would not be de jure, it would not be a law like it is in China, but there is a lot of de facto kind of moral sorting that is possible with companies having this much power. I mean, it comes from the fact that American public life is now largely conducted through these media companies, and they control who gets to play ball. Now, I think they've been erring much too much on the side of a kind of morally neutral bulletin board kind of model where like anybody can say anything, including half the Republican Party can post that we're living in this upside down world where the election was stolen and we should go to Washington and try to hang the vice president of the United States. That's what was going on Parler. So that, that it's too far to say that's perfectly okay. But we do have to be on guard toward figuring out how to regulate how these companies make these very important public decisions.
I actually
I'm sorry. Go
I
ahead,
share
Catherine.
I share much of this ambivalence that I do think companies have a responsibility to avoid contributing to violence, and clearly they have the legal power to do so. I think AWS had some sort of filing today or yesterday where they said that they dropped Parler because Parler had been, the site had been hosting threats of rape, torture, and assassination of named public officials. That seems totally within the public interest to say that they should take all of that down, and good for them for doing it. And as an aside, Trump has railed against the Section 230 protections, but in fact, if, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, if in fact that liability shield were taken away from companies, they would have greater incentive to censor because
Correct.
they would be held responsible, legally responsible for those kinds of threats. But I do feel a bit uneasy about how much power these several companies have over public discourse. I don't know what the remedy is for that, but I do. I, it makes me uncomfortable that Mark Zuckerberg kind of has so much say over whose speech is heard. Again, not by law, but I don't know that I quite buy the dystopian vision that airlines are going to get involved in this deplatforming game too. But I do think it's a problem we have to grapple with as someone who believes in free speech and that more speech is better than less speech. If we're talking about uncomfortable ideas as opposed to incitement to violence, I think that's a much grayer area, and I don't know what the right resolution is legally
I mean, I
around
would
So,
just,
Bill, yeah, I'm bringing you in now. I just wanted to mention that the story went around this week that Angela Merkel had said she was upset that Trump had been deplatformed by Twitter, but actually what she said was that such decisions are too important to be left to tech CEOs. What did you want to add to that, if anything?
Well, I am, you know, I am where Catherine is on this one, with worries extending out in both directions. Uh, but I do think there's a remedy that needs to be put on the table.
Hmm.
Uh, a classic response to excessive concentrations of unchecked corporate power is antitrust enforcement. And we may have to reconsider, and renovate some of our antitrust laws. But I've been arguing for years that that Facebook is the Standard Oil of our day. I understand the economics of network effects, et cetera, are very different. But I've been arguing for years that Borkian antitrust is dead wrong, that consumer cost and efficiency are not the only variables to be considered in antitrust determinations. I think if I agree with Angela Merkel that these decisions shouldn't be made by a corporate CEO. But if we broke up Facebook, we wouldn't be having this discussion, or at least we wouldn't be
Yeah,
worried nearly as much.
but on the other hand, if you look at the dimension on which these competitors are competing on, it's not more moderation, right? It's look at what Parler does, right? They say we do no moderation. I'm not sure that that's a better outcome either. That when you do have competitors, if their way in which they differentiate themselves is that they say we just allow more threats of violence. I'm not sure that's really the right
Right.
that's the
Would
best
it be
outcome either. I mean, probably you need some regulation, but I don't know how you
well,
do
it
that and
might
stay
be
on the right side of the
possible
First
to
Amendment.
it might be possible to rewrite Section 230 to encourage a bit more moderation by the platforms, so that because right now it's pretty broad. I mean, they have pretty broad immunity. They can keep child pornography off their sites, but as far as threats and all the rest of it, that's up to them. And maybe we could tighten that a bit through the law. What do you think, Bill?
Uh, I have looked at this question, and I'm sympathetic in principle to the idea of revising Section 230. But every practical proposal that I've seen to do it, creates just a mare's nest of legal complications, and it would be an invitation to litigation that would never stop. It may be the best of a bad lot of options, but I have to say, in response to Catherine, that it is what we're now in a situation where, in effect, Facebook has a much larger reach than Fox News. I'd rather have a situation, frankly, uh, in which some uh, you know of these internet providers were engaged in a race to the bottom, uh, like Parler, and others would have an entirely different model appealing to a very different audience. I think that would be a healthier situation than a situation in which one company dominates the landscape the way Facebook does. I could be argued
Right.
out of that, but that's my instinct.
But aren't you just wishing into existence these platforms that will take the high road? I mean, we
You know
don't know
what?
that they would.
When the history suggests that when monopolies are broken up, remember AT&T,
Mm.
new competitors spring up.
Yeah, but not necessarily competitor. I mean, in the old days, that was a matter of providing better service at a lower price. Now we're talking about providing, a more a cleaner political hygiene environment. That's a whole different
It is, but I'd
set of
rather.
expectations.
But suppose Parler or something like that ended up with 1/5 the reach that Facebook now has. That would be better than the situation now, where in effect these crazy people are allowed to communicate instantly with 2 billion others.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Bill. I mean,
Look, no, nobody's sure. Nobody's sure, but we have to be.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that the problem is more one of networking, and that it's sort of whether you have one platform or 10 platforms is sort of irrelevant. That these websites function by connecting people in virtual space along a kind of an opinion matrix, so that if I were, say, if I were a member of the Ku Klux Klan in 1920 Indiana, how much how much bad could I do in America at that moment? It was sort of limited to the other members of the Klan in my local community, maybe my county, region of the state, maybe the state as a whole. But that's about it. There's not much more I could do. To influence the country as a whole. But now we have a world where, because of these platforms, people who are like-minded and have extremely pernicious, morally execrable, but also kind of far out often lunatic, delusional views can find people who have exactly the same lunatic views anywhere in the world, and in our country, anywhere in the country. And so it doesn't at all make me happy that, the people who were doing what they were doing on Parler, um, whether it's, I guess, better that they're doing it on Parler than on Facebook, because the potential audience for it is much larger on Facebook. But that was a kind of incitement machine there. They were a bunch of lunatics whipping each other into a frenzy to overthrow the government and kill the vice president in like public view of everybody. And breaking it up, making it bigger, making it smaller, I think is just the wrong dimension to make sense of what to do about it. And I frankly don't have any good ideas about what to do
Well,
about it. But
may I jump in with just one thought, which is that the experts in this field do tend to stress that the algorithms of these websites are a big part of the problem. That is the Facebook algorithm that takes you progressively from one site, one relatively benign group, to a more and more extreme one the longer you stay on the platform. That kind of thing can be regulated, it seems to me. I mean, that's a matter of just tracking how it works and and suggesting that if their very own algorithms are drawing people into radicalism, that can be contained
yeah,
through regulation.
last point that I'll make on this is that I agree that is a huge problem. It's a huge problem on YouTube. If you put in a right wing person or video on YouTube, it will start sending you only right wing and progressively more and more extreme of the same
Right.
thing. So that is a problem, and it points to how we've gotten here in part. The problem is that I fear we already have tens of millions of people who are already there. And like Parler wasn't doing what you described because every single person who was there was already as radical as they could get.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm more concerned about is not necessarily this radicalization tendency, which I do think we should regulate and try to control if we can by changing the algorithms. But I'm equally or more concerned with the ability of the people who have already been radicalized by this stuff over the last 15 years to use it as a way of organizing, again, a kind of revolutionary movement in this country that can be incredibly dangerous in the real world. And that's what I was seeing happening on Parler. So anyway, I'll stop talking.
And Parler has now been thankfully deplatformed itself. So AWS and others have said, nope, we're just not going to host it. So that's good for now. But that brings us to our third topic, and we've run a little long, so we're going to have to truncate this a bit. But we do have tens of millions of people in this country who believe the lie about the election being stolen. We have tens of millions of people who are radicalized in a variety of ways, many on the right, some on the left as well. What do we make of the chances that poor Joe Biden, who is arguably the best possible person to, in some ways, the best possible figure to be taking office at a time like this, but he is 78, and his task is gargantuan to try to tamp down these fires. Bill Galston, what do you think?
Well, there are better and worse routes for him to pursue, but given the size of the task, he can't do it by himself. And to return to an earlier theme, the Democratic Party can't do it by itself. And I think what's really important is that reasonable people of both parties join hands and say that the moment that we reached is too dangerous just to do business as usual and to revert to the kinds of no-holds-barred legislative strategies that we have been using vis-a-vis each other really for the better part of 2 decades. We just can't afford this anymore. It's too dangerous. Uh, and so let's not load this all on Joe Biden. I've spoken many times about the agenda I think he could pursue that would be most likely to pour oil on troubled waters. I'm not going to go into detail in the short time that we have right now, but there are some choices he has to make that would make a difference there. But I think that getting the responsible leaders of the Republican Party on board for a serious national bipartisan effort of de escalation, cooling, and persuasion is absolutely critical.
Catherine, do you think that's possible?
I agree with Bill that the burden should not be on Biden alone, or even not predominantly on Biden. Really, the hard work that has to be done by Republican leadership. They're the ones who, again, have sort of fed these collective delusions within what was once the fringe of the party and has now sort of taken over the party. And they need to be the ones to say, hey, we were wrong. It's time to work together. I mean, you hear a lot of calls lately from Republican politicians for, you know, now is the time for unity, now is the time for harmony. They're calling for that from the Democrats, but they need to call for it among their own base. um, otherwise it's just unilateral disarmament where one side gets to, show up with bombs and gallows, which literally happened a week ago, and the other side just has to say, okay, let's have a big group hug. I think
No.
you really need Republicans showing good faith, working with Biden where there is common ground. And if there isn't common policy ground, just make it about that, not about demonizing and not about saying the election was stolen. I think obviously there's a lot of work to be done by Biden himself as well, and I agree that he is unusually qualified to serve as sort of that um, harmonizing figurehead. But I would have argued the same thing about Obama, frankly. Obama ran on a message of healing America and change we can believe in and we can work together. And the problem with running on a platform of working together is that it's very easy for your opposition to prove you a failure simply by not cooperating. And
Hmm.
so we really need to have Republican leadership stepping up to the plate and saying, "Hey guys, we misled you. Now's the time to make peace." And you need Democrats saying it on their side too. But right now, and there is a lot of infighting within the Democratic Party, by the way, which we haven't even touched on. Which I'm not even sure Biden can himself cool tensions there. But in any event, I really think the burden needs to be largely upon Republican leadership at this point.
JVL, it is amazing to watch Republicans today during the debate over impeachment standing up and saying, this is bad. This is going to tear the country apart. This is bad for national unity." Um, what do you make of the argument that what do you think is the likelihood, I should ask, that responsible Republican leaders will step forward and say, you know what, this has gone too far, and if we want to maintain civil peace and have, and not destroy the country, we're going to have to turn down the temperature. We're going to have to admit error. What do you think the chances of that are?
Well, it doesn't matter what the Republican leaders want. It matters what Republican voters want. And I think it's pretty clear that that is not what Republican voters want. Every single poll I've seen for 2 months has shown that somewhere between 70 and 80% of Republican voters think that Donald Trump won the election and Joe Biden is an illegitimate authoritarian strongman. So what is the policy remedy to that? I mean, Joe Biden could come out and say, "I'm going to give a $10,000 check to every white high school educated male in Appalachia who's missing more than 3 teeth." And are they going to say, "Oh, well, then that means that you are legitimate"? Sure, I'll be. No, they're not going to go right. I mean, they view him literally as an authoritarian strongman, so you can't buy their cooperation. That's not how this works. I think that the near to medium term goal for the Democratic Party needs to be to peel off just enough Republican support to hold on to the White House and the House of Representatives for the next decade or so. And wait as demographic change, which, if you sort of listen to Ron Brownstein and some of the other smart people who look at this, suggest that over the next 10 years, the Republican coalition as it exists now, where it is powered largely by white men with less than a college education, that group is going to continue to get smaller and smaller. But because of the geographic advantages given to the Republican Party by our system, they are able to leverage what is a small and dwindling base into a good deal of national power. And they have shown that the Republican Party is a pro-authoritarianism party, I mean, just as an objective fact. And so the good of America depends upon Democrats holding power for the next several cycles. And I wish there were something better about that. I wish that I believed that there were Republican office holders who believed in things like the greater good and the functioning of government and all that. But I just don't see any reason to believe that that is true.
So, what did you make of McConnell's actions today, if not a bid for better government and some retribution for what Trump has done? What
Which
did you make
action?
of his actions?
The one where he
The-
leaked to Axios that he was in favor of it and just might
Yeah,
vote for it, or then
yeah.
the one where he said,
No,
"Hey,
the
we're not
first
going to hold a
one.
vote."
The first one.
The first one is meaningless. Right.
Mm,
This is what we've seen from Republicans since I don't know, the Access Hollywood tape. Right.
mm,
Oh, it's terrible, this thing, but sure, we're going to vote for him. You know,
mhm, mhm.
yeah, it's absolutely meaningless, and the reason is because I think these guys are cowards, but they're not wrong because they understand what their voters want. Their voters want this. This stuff that you and I and the people in this podcast, Mona, think of as a great tragedy, Republican voters by and large agree with. And that is the root of all of this. This is not an elite problem. This is a cultural and a demographic and a voter problem. And, we are here not by accident, but by something close to inevitability, because this is what our citizenry demands, or at least good 35 to 40% of it.
So, Damon, 35 to 40% is not the people. I've heard from a lot of people in the last week who, having finally been hit by the side of the head with a 2x4, say, "Oh, you know what? You were right about Trump." Sometimes apparently it takes this, but those are the kinds of voters, suburban professional types, who very well might be in a position to keep Democrats in power in the House for the next several cycles if the Democrats play their cards right?
Yeah, I mean, I always hesitate to extrapolate too much about the future from the present because things happen and change so quickly now. The next election facing us 2 years from now is like an eternity, and who knows what will happen between now and then. I would say that at the moment, it's important to remember that when was Trump's lowest public approval moment? And it was right around the time of the Charlottesville riot when he came out and talked about very fine people on both sides. What happened last week was sort of like the Charlottesville rally writ large at the nation's capital. I have no doubt that if the presidential election were held again today, Trump would lose massively more than he did. Biden would win by a large landslide, far more than he in fact did, because a lot of people hate this stuff. The numbers really have moved in the last week in a positive way. The question is, what you have is a kind of rump of the Republican electorate that loves Trump and everything he does and loved everything he did and loves the worst of him, so that the worse he is, the more they like him. those are the people who showed up last week and rioted and attempted to do so much damage and did so much damage in the nation's capital. Think about it. These are people who bought plane tickets and flew to Washington to do this. Most of them were not locals. That takes a lot of commitment. They care about this. They really believe it. But those people aren't anywhere near enough to say win a House majority or a Senate majority or a presidency. If that's all the Republican Party is, they're going to lose in landslides in every direction for as far as the eye can see. The problem is that in our system, unlike in a parliamentary system where a coalition is formed after the vote, in our system, the coalition is formed before the vote in the party structure as a whole. And the Republican Party is this amalgam of these different groups, and the other non-Trumpy groups, most of them were all willing to just go along with it for the sake of their tax cuts or their regulation cuts or their abortion restrictions or whatever it was, or their hatred of liberals. And you put all those pieces together with this crazy Trumpy chunk, which makes up maybe a third of or a half of the party who just love, again, these are the ones who not only approve of Trump, but love him. The worse he is, the better. The question really is, does that coalition stay together? Do those non-Trumpist factions in the party continue to hold their nose and keep going along with it for the sake of these other things they both love and loathe? Or do they start to drift away, just not show up on election day because they can't stomach that the party is just becoming more and more toxic? And that's the thing that will be decided over the next 2 and 4 years, and we can't answer yet.
Okay, we are now at the final segment, and so I want to get to our highlights, things we want to draw attention to. Catherine Rampell, you go first.
Sure. So the story that I was going to draw attention to is one from NPR that came out today, reporting that Trump's Census Bureau has stopped trying to jam through this report on the unauthorized immigrant population, which was part of Trump's effort to exclude unauthorized immigrants from the official census enumeration. I don't know if you all are familiar with this.
Yes.
But in any event, there had been an IG report that came out in the last few days, maybe yesterday, I'm losing track of time, indicating that they were really trying to get this through before Trump left office. It's not clear if the career officials have sort of taken back control of the asylum from the inmates, and that's what happened, or if the top political appointee, Dillingham, decided to quash this effort, or what have you. But in any event, I think this is all interesting. And in some sense, even if they don't ultimately put together this report on where all the undocumented immigrants live and try to keep them from being counted for the purposes of apportionment and all of that, I do worry that the long term effect that Trump and his various underlings were going for will have been achieved anyway. In that there were these efforts to depress responses in the decennial census from immigrants, both through this announcement about how, about sort of tracking the populations of unauthorized immigrants for the purposes of apportionment and enumeration, and the previous citizenship question that Trump had tried to add to the decennial census. Both of those efforts now seem to have failed, or shortly will be dead. But if they had the effect of depressing responses, the data will still be bad. And the census data are used as the baseline for basically every other source of federal statistics that we have going forward. So I'm very concerned about the kind of corrosive effect on, basically Trump's alternative facts will persist beyond him, because
Right.
the underlying data will be garbage, or if not garbage, will be
At least a little bit flawed, yeah.
at least flawed, and that will have ripple effects through, all sorts of statistics that the private sector uses, that the government uses when allocating funding, and every survey that's ever conducted over the next 10 years. So anyway, it's kind of a in the weeds thing, but it's something that I'm worried about and that I hope gets more attention in the weeks and months ahead about how to fix some of the problems uh, of the data collected in 2020.
Right.
Also related to COVID, there were also problems there, but
Right.
some of them were deliberate because of
Okay.
these anti-immigrant efforts.
Well, thank you. And I know you have to jump off. So thank you so much. I'll thank you now for joining us. Appreciate it. Okay, Bill Galston.
Well, I'm going to overperform today and offer something bad and something good to highlight. First, the bad, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but I really care about this. Michael Pack's war against the free press continues.
Yeah.
The latest episode was yanking a VOA reporter off off the beat for daring to ask Secretary Pompeo a question. Uh, it I'm not sure I understand how a reporter can do his or her job without asking public officials questions. And I invite interested listeners to review the questions for themselves to see if they went beyond the bounds of propriety. Uh, in my judgment, as you may have guessed, they did not. Now for something good. Uh, we have lots of law schools in this country producing lots of lawyers. That has some downsides for the country. One of the upsides is that we have smart law professors examining virtually every question, including every constitutional question. And an Indiana University law professor by the name of Gerard Maglioka has recently completed a 67-page paper on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Uh, and here's what he has to say. He said, this is a paraphrase, a majority vote in Congress would express lawmakers' opinion that Section 3 applies in a specific case to a specific individual. The courts would then have to make that legal determination. Quote, it is not just something that Congress can do, he said in an interview. Now, no doubt there will be other views surfacing in the next 24 hours as to the meaning and application of Section 3, but nobody should imagine that it will be less complicated or controversial than the impeachment and removal route.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Damon.
Well, I've pointed to the writings before by a guy named Ivan Krastev, who's a Bulgarian intellectual, spends a lot of his time in Vienna, where he runs a think tank. I think he's one of the shrewdest analysts of global politics around right now. He had an op-ed in the New York Times earlier this week titled "Trump Has Made America a Laughingstock." And I include this in the interest of keeping our eyes on the broadest possible perspective, though we're naturally and understandably focused on domestic issues right now. We need to keep in mind the wider world. I'll just read a couple sentences from this to give people a flavor of what he's saying here. The storming of the Capitol and the growing prospects of Mr. Trump's impeachment in his last hours in power have showcased not simply a crisis of American democracy, but a crisis of American power. Next to Washington's monumental failure to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, Washington law enforcement's inexplicable failure to prevent protesters from invading the Capitol makes America look dysfunctional and weak to its enemies and unreliable to its allies. It didn't help that this occurred just weeks after the humiliation of America's cybersecurity defenses in the case of Russia's hacking of at least 10 federal agencies. So, again, for the sake of the big picture, I offer that and very much recommend it to our listeners to take a read and to put Krastev on your list of important people to keep tabs on. He's very smart.
Thank you. It reminds me of something that someone posted on Twitter, which was a picture of Trump's face superimposed on the body of that guy who showed up at the Capitol in furs with his face painted and the helmet and the whole get up. And it said, the way the world sees the United States today.
The Animal
So,
House Putsch.
yeah. Okay, JVL.
There's a writer, Mike Giglio, who is a war correspondent who spent the last year embedded with various militia movements in the U.S. And writing about it. And his stuff has been great. He published a piece over the weekend at The Intercept where he went talking to his militia sources and asking them about their reactions to what happened on January 6th. And the picture which emerges is that this is not a one-off. This is not, people think that, oh, well, the insurrection is over, and it's not over. We have a rally scheduled for January 17th in the US, and then there is January 20th, Inauguration Day. One of the fellows Mike talked with is a guy named Justin Thayer, who leads a militia in Georgia. He is mainstream enough that he was a volunteer for Kelly Loeffler's campaign. And when Mike spoke to Mr. Thayer said that what was next for them was to pray and prepare for the 20th, the 20th of January, and that he and his militia planned to be in Washington, D.C. And I just want to read to you what he told Mike Giglio at The Intercept. When we actually get involved, we're going to kill Democrats, liberals, and communists at a rate that will defy anything that's occurred in history. And when that happens, we're going to make sure that it's done so thoroughly that we don't ever have to have this argument again. It's going to be so ugly and ruthless. We're going to go to the homes of the tank operators and kill their wives and children and nail them to the walls. This is America. People think that this is, oh, it's just a couple guys. It's not just a couple guys. It's a lot of guys. And we are in this fight against authoritarianism for the long haul. Donald Trump has lit a fire that, will not be extinguished for several years.
Okay, I agree that this is something we need to be very worried about. I don't agree with your saying this is America. I think that's a little bit too far, but it's certainly part of America and a bigger part than we realize. I would agree that far. All right, I would like to draw attention to something that was published in the New York Times Magazine by the historian Timothy Snyder. It's called The American Abyss. And it's full of interesting insights, not all of which I agreed with, but many of which I did. He's a historian of fascism. And one of the things, there were a number of, in addition to its really, really thorough analysis of where we've come to in America, he had a couple of great one-liners. And one of them was, post-truth is pre-fascism. And another was describing people like Hawley and Cruz. He said, just because you've sold your soul to the devil doesn't mean that you drove a hard bargain. And it's well worth your time. Again, it's Timothy Snyder, The American Abyss. And on that gloomy note, let us hope that the coming week isn't as desperately bad as we fear. And we will gather again next week to discuss the inauguration of Joseph Robinette Biden. And we hope only that. All right. Thank you, one and all. And we'll be back next week as every week.